Hey, just a quick heads up, this video is a sequel to a previous timeline wherein Scandinavia remained united under the Kalmar Union. In that, they went on to conquer most of the Baltic coast from the Commonwealth, became a steadfast ally of France during the 16 to 1700s, colonizing what we know to be eastern Canada, and passed a tripartite act of union between all three that formalized the creation of a Riksdag based on the loosely defined Swedish model based on the class structure of the nobility, merchants, and clergy. They still converted to Protestantism during the Reformation, and their languages have converged to an even greater degree than they ever did in our timeline. Oh, and I'm sorry if the sound quality is a little off, I just moved into a new apartment and I don't have any soundproofing up. With all of that out of the way, let's get right into the video. Now, we ended that video around the beginning of the 1700s, speculating on a potential war between Russia and Scandinavia. I mentioned how Russia had about 10 million people, and that even with me buffing out the Scandinavian population, I could only see them at about 4 million. However, that didn't really account for some of the territorial growth. In addition, I wasn't able to verify the numbers I was using were going by borders at the time or the area today, but I found this map on the World Population Review that seems to indicate the latter. This does have some problems still, since we can't account for specifically the German territories of Pomerania, Prussia, and Schleswig-Holstein. Regardless, adding up the areas under the Kalmar Union gets us to a population of 3.5 million, but multiplying by 1.2, the ratio I used last time, only gets us to 4.2 million either way. But considering the population boom in Europe really started in the late 1600s and 1700s due to the Columbian Exchange and the almighty potato, I think we can justify multiplying that 3.5 by around 1.45 to get us to 5.1 million. This is much more in line with the other European powers, specifically their rivals in Britain and the Netherlands, but they are still only about half as populated as Russia. Now let's start with this Russo-Scandinavian War I mentioned in the 1700s. This is likely just the latest in a series of them, but details are obviously difficult. There were a few northern wars during the heyday of the Swedish Empire, this hypothetical conflict actually being very similar to the Great Northern War, but obviously the context is incredibly different. Regardless, Russia would want to control the Baltic shore. Scandinavia would want Russia to not control the Baltic shore, which they currently control. Now, Scandinavia has historically had good ties with the Ottomans and likely some control over Poland, so the context could be somewhat removed from the Baltic specifically, but the real cause of the war would be the same. Regardless, Scandinavia is fighting nearly 2-to-1 in terms of population, but Russia is hamstrung by the continuation of serfdom, while Scandinavia is likely much more in line with the increasing professionalization of military forces. Throw in Poland and possibly even the Ottomans, and the odds are a lot more even than you might think. However, this is also Peter the Great we're talking about, meaning that just beating Russia isn't going to make them actually surrender. Peter managed to drag this fight out 21 years in our timeline, and I see no reason to assume that this war would be quick in the slightest. However, Russia's allies in this war are difficult to determine. Poland could certainly be flipped to their side, Brandenburg and possibly even Austria as well, but I don't think this would be enough to actually break Scandinavia's military supremacy, assuming that the king doesn't drag it out. Action might be on Scandinavia's side, but time is on Russia's. Thus, over the next 8 to 10 years, Scandinavia, the Ottomans, and their faction in Poland will face down Russia, Austria, and their own Polish faction. Scandinavia has the superior military and economic standing, and the Ottomans are certainly still powerful enough to be a problem for Austria, but Poland being in a full-on civil war will make them difficult for either side to work with. In addition, Russia and Austria will still have large populations and good terrain to defend. As a result, this war will be far from easy, but with a little luck, I think we can squeeze out a win for the Northern Coalition. The treaty won't be especially harsh. Scandinavia already has a lot of the land it would want from Russia, but I could imagine some border concessions to push it further south, and likely some land given to Poland or the Ottomans to keep Russia weak and distracted. The big thing is that doing this discredits Peter the Great's reforms and drastically weakens the Russian state in the long term, keeping them more feudal rather than the 18th century royal autocracy. Of course, Russia famously already was an absolute monarchy, but there's a difference between that being the case on paper and in reality due to serfdom. Scandinavia will also be dealing with the role of the monarchy. Now, because our point of divergence required messing with the succession at the start of the Kalmar Union, we have absolutely no precedent for who is in charge in the country. However, in the first part, I talked about the creation of a formal Riksdag to advise the king as part of the requirements to get Sweden to accept the Act of Union that created the tripartite kingdom of Scandinavia. However, this entity is a lot weaker than the British Parliament. It likely doesn't have power over taxation and isn't beholden to the population, but represents the classes of the country, specifically the nobility, clergy, and the burghers, aka merchants. The problem with this is that it is a lot less dynamic and able to adapt to crisis. In addition, the Riksdag has very little, if any, means to check royal power. It doesn't have any power over taxation, meaning it likely doesn't control the state budgets, and it has very little sway over foreign policy. However, Scandinavia also has a much better financial situation than certain other absolute countries, which will keep it much more centralized. However, if it ever loses a war or the economy declines, then the whole thing will likely come crumbling down. Now, something that came up a few times in the comments was the idea of Gothenburg becoming the capital instead of Stockholm. These comments cited its central location and position on the coast, but the main reason I moved the royal residence to Stockholm early on was entirely to appease Sweden within the tumultuous early days of the Union. However, now that the situation is stabilized and the country has a burgeoning colonial empire, I do think that Gothenburg would explode onto the scene in terms of economic and political importance, or at least a city like it. See, YouTube comments are far from the first group to realize how important this region would be, even ones as smart as my viewers, and numerous cities and towns have existed on this stretch of the Swedish coast, with the modern version of Gothenburg being founded by Gustavus Adolphus, which is impossible in this timeline. However, with the rise of a colonial empire, the need to travel between all three parts of the country growing, and the fact that the Norwegian mountains aren't getting any more hospitable, I think that this country's existence and importance would converge on our timeline. Strictly speaking, I think the old name of Lodos would likely still be official, but for the sake of coherence with the video, I'm going with Gothenburg. However, I don't think it will become the capital just off of that. The active union between all three states only formalized in 1650, before Gothenburg's big boom. Instead, I think that as the Scandinavian Empire grows and trade bustles in, it will receive more and more royal investment, likely even including a palace. Thus, by 1730 or so, as it becomes a major city and the king likely faces mounting pressure from the Danish and Norwegian nobility, they finally just make it their traditional home. This, at least de facto, makes it the capital of the country, but de jure there likely isn't one. Strictly speaking, London isn't the official capital of Britain or England, it's just where the royals have lived for 1,000 years, and the chambers of government were built around that. This move would likely be seen as very significant in a cultural and symbolic sense of Scandinavian nationalism and a break from feudalism into a more modern state, but that's hard to really quantify. Panning out, let's take stock of the rest of Europe. Scandinavia is, generally speaking, competing with England and the Netherlands in the North Sea, as well as Austria for control over northern Germany. As a result, it's tied heavily into the French diplomatic bloc, though it certainly has had its conflicts with Paris as well. Scandinavian power during the 30 Years' War and their conquest of northern Poland, however, led them to conquering Pomerania and Ducal Prussia, which obviously prevents the kingdom from existing. This has a lot of ramifications, but right now the biggest one is that Austria retained Silesia. I could also see them being more powerful over northern Germany. The rise of Prussia was a serious problem for Habsburg dominion over the HRE since they were no longer the military hegemon in Germany. Here, however, while Scandinavia is likely more powerful in a straight fight, Germany is only one of their many fronts, and Austria only one of its many rivals, in contrast to Brandenburg Prussia, which had a lot more room to focus on just Austria. Finally, Poland still enters its state of decline, since the Sejm isn't exactly rendered less corrupt just because one of the countries bribing every politician is swapped for another. In fact, with Scandinavia's relative wealth compared to Russia, Austria, or in our timeline Prussia, I think they'd have more influence over the country than the other occupiers, a contributing factor to the civil war that occurred during the Northern War of this timeline. This Nordic faction would likely come to power promising reforms and modernization akin to their Scandinavian patrons, but I doubt that would mean anything more than token reforms that leave Krakow as a protectorate of Gothenburg. Sorry for the very quick interruption, but if you're enjoying the video so far, please consider like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow and lets me know that you guys want to see more content like this in the future. Scandinavia's biggest rival, however, would always be England. Britain at this time only has about 1 million more people than them, and it is easily the biggest navy in Europe with the decline of Spain. But, according to this paper from Western Oregon University, Britain had to import a lot of the wood for their ships, especially the masts, from Norway and New England. Norway is an obvious problem since that's part of the now federated kingdom that isn't exactly too keen on Britain as a whole, and that same country has colonized most of New England and Canada via their highway around Iceland. This is a serious hurdle for the British Royal Navy, but admittedly not one that I would consider prohibitive to their rise as a great power. Britain isn't always at war with Scandinavia, and it would be reductionist to assume that Britain would be as haphazard with their lumber supply in a world where they have to consider their main provider as a rival. Haphazard? Sure, just probably not that haphazard. The Netherlands would also be a major rival for the Scandinavians, but they especially relied on their money from overseas trade and colonial expansion, so it's hard to necessarily comment on how powerful they are before we've established where the other powers colonize. So let's get on that, shall we? Obviously, this is all to be taken with a grain of salt, but one thing I think we can be relatively certain of is a Scandinavian presence in northeastern North America, like I mentioned. This is made somewhat easier for them than, say, Britain or France, due to their control over Iceland. As a result, they can hook around it and cross the ocean where the distance is relatively short, allowing them both better colonial logistics and military control over the colonies. The actual settlement of the colony is unpredictable, but I imagine a lot of religious dissidents, maybe ethnic minorities. Also, interestingly, colonial dialects like that in the US, Canada, and even Quebecois French tend to be a bit more conservative, so to speak, than the mother country, so while the dialects and languages of Scandinavia proper will likely be converging into one standardized Scandinavian/Norse language, The colonial populations could wind up more akin to whatever Norse ethnicity wound up calling the shots in the given colony. However, like I mentioned last time, the real moneymakers in the Americas were the Caribbean sugar plantation, and I see no reason to think that Scandinavia would pass up the blood money. The slave trade was utterly massive and instrumental in making things like sugar, cotton, and tobacco affordable for the Europeans, causing an economic boom all across the continent. However, it was also one of, if not the biggest crime against humanity ever carried out, and Sweden and Denmark, Norway both played minor parts in the tragedy. Here, they're much stronger, and as a result likely get much more lucrative colonies all over the Caribbean and West Africa. To give not credit, but to be honest, they likely won't be as bad as the Portuguese in Brazil, and especially not France and Haiti, but this will still be a major dehumanization of countless people and black mark on the legacy of Scandinavia, one that likely gets a lot more attention in this world. However, the absolute big moneymakers in the colonial game were in Asia rather than the New World. Whether it's England and India, the Dutch and Indonesia, or France and also India at this time actually, all the European powers were eager to carve their way into the region. Now, this one is entirely up to chance and internal politicking, but I think it'd be a bit boring to tie this into the Anglo-French battle for world domination. Instead, I'm moving Scandinavia more into Indonesia. Now, articles on the Dutch conquest of Indonesia are more difficult to find than you might think, so take this with a grain of salt. However, we know that starting in the 1600s, the VOC used a lot of mercenaries and played local powers off of each other to conquer the region, just like in India. However, the Dutch, being less populated and with easily the least resources to go around among the great powers, also had a greater deal of piracy and weren't in full control over Indonesia until late into the 19th century. However, I think that Scandinavia changes that dynamic a little. Firstly, they are able to play the locals against the Dutch, and the Dutch will return fire, creating a balance of power dynamic between the two in the area. Secondly, because the Dutch weren't as hegemonic in the region as the British were in India, there was a greater degree of piracy that they couldn't contain. With a second European power, this seems unlikely, and as a result, the two of them get much more mileage out of their exploitation than they would if they were the only ones trying to control the entire archipelago. However, without their actual hegemony, the Dutch will be much weaker than in real life. In fact, as they conquer more and more of Indonesia from the Dutch and locals throughout the 1600s and make buckets worth of blood money from the heyday of the West Indies sugar plantations, I would expect Scandinavia to have something of a golden age around the 1700s. The economy would likely continue growing throughout this, bringing money into the cities that creates a lot of art and cultural movements. I'm not the best at art history, so I won't get too detailed here, but it is worth considering. Gothenburg would especially boom during this time, as would Oslo and Copenhagen, coastal cities that directly trade with the empire that's bringing in all this money. In contrast, while Stockholm wouldn't be a poor city, it would likely enter a state of relative decline compared to its importance in preceding centuries. Regarding other colonizers, I don't really see a point in messing with them too much. The French likely tried the St. Lawrence River route for a northwest passage, fail, and get laughed at in Danish before settling along the Gulf Coast in Louisiana, while the English are shifted down into Pennsylvania and Virginia, which were already the two most populated colonies. However, England will be the biggest rival in the Americas. Interestingly, without Canada, the Anglo-French rivalry might take a backseat in North America, with England instead focusing on Scandinavia and Spain, the latter of whom has very lucrative colonies, and also Florida. That region isn't so much good for money, but for controlling access to the other colonies. These colonies are more or less handled according to our timeline, though the various Protestant sects and persecuted groups that founded the new English colonies obviously aren't in the area to do so here. If they make it into Virginia, this could be interesting, since these sects went on to near universally condemn slavery, which could have consequences in the colony, or they assimilate into the pro-slavery rhetoric of the time and nothing changes either or. But returning to Europe, the geopolitics of the 18th century would likely be rough for Scandinavia. Now, this all starts with the War of Spanish Succession, which strictly speaking is likely impossible due to the dynastic messiness around this entire timeline. However, I think it's fair to put a butterfly net around this, since it's not like the Catholic Habsburgs would be intermarrying with the Protestant Norse. France is the wrinkle, but frankly, I'm already pretending that Louis XIV is here somewhere. Now, here's the problem with this war. France and Scandinavia get along, but every other European great power that got involved did so against France, whose only allies were half of Spain and some German states, since France was also gunning for control over Germany. While a resurgent Habsburg dominion would be bad for Scandinavian plains in Germany, so would a French dominion over the region, and the fact is that Scandinavia wouldn't like the idea of a Franco-Spanish union any more than the rest of Europe. As a result, they likely stay out of the conflict or get involved against France due to something in Saxony. France then still loses the war, albeit with minimal, if any, changes from real life. It's the War of Austrian Succession that gets very interesting. Or at least whatever equivalent happens in this timeline. Because Scandinavia, with its interests in northern Germany and its rivalry with Austria, is likely the one challenging Maria Theresa's right to the throne of Austria. And while they're at it, probably throwing a fit about British Hanover too. In real life, this was the Third Silesian War, and more or less only served as a gamble by Frederick the Great to weaken Austrian control over the HRE, and cemented their right to Silesia. However, here it would mostly just be that first thing. Scandinavian borders are already massive and unwieldy. I doubt they're that interested in Silesia specifically. We're going to have this war last a while, though. In real life, it was a 7-year war before 7-year wars were cool, and Sweden was fighting Britain, Hanover, the Dutch, and Russia. Now let's make that Scandinavia the principal leader of the alliance and have them fight all those same groups while also fighting deep in Germany, shall we? I could easily see this war being like 9 years, and Hanover, as always, defies death, built out as it always was by the British personal union, with the king turning over whatever colonial territory he needs to in order to keep his title as an elector in the HRE. Austria is likely weakened and their hegemony reduced to southern Germany for now, but I don't think Scandinavia is actually able to exploit the power vacuum and take it over. With Britain retaining Hanover, Saxony being loyal to Austria, and the strain of a 3, arguably 4-front war on the finances, I don't think Scandinavia is quite in a position to make those kinds of moves. In fact, I think this war could cause a serious backlash on the Riksdag. By now, the merchants are easily the wealthiest class in the country, but they still only have one class-based vote, and of course the vast majority of the country have no vote, but who cares about the poors? I imagine there would likely be a lot of unrest from this group trying to give the Reichstag some real teeth, possibly with strikes/withholding of taxes until their desired reforms go through. Possibly even revolt if the king pushes their button. I'm imagining a more parliamentary system inspired by the British, wherein certain constituencies send a representative, and a majority in that body is then required to actually pass a budget. Of course, they'd likely keep the traditional Riksdag system around as an upper house, but they'd absolutely want genuine political power, likely with a wealth-based franchise to keep the peasantry as peasantry. Now, I'm making this sound like it happens very quickly. Still, I actually don't think so. I'm imagining this rise in parliamentarianism/revolutionary liberalism as a reaction to royal bellicosity surrounding the War of Austrian Succession and the failure to actually win the peace, leading to the king pushing for greater taxes that are then wasted over the next 5 to 8 years. It's only then that the merchants start to raise a major stink. Regarding the politics that emerged from the shakeup, it's hard to say. I imagine there would be a major debate among even the merchants over how much power to give the Riksdag. After all, the original Tories in Britain were more or less monarchist, supporting the continued right of the king to act in a similar vein to what the US president would do later on, while the Whigs became known as the Liberals, supporting parliamentarianism. They were the ones who would later support what's called Catholic emancipation to give citizenship to that group. It seems very likely to me a similar dynamic emerges in Scandinavia. It's also worth noting that because the franchise is wealth-based and likely does require being Protestant, that this Scandinavia would be just as restrictive in franchise as the British are across the North Sea. Now, by the 1740s, we'd likely be due for another Anglo-French war to take over the world, but it probably can't start the same way as the 7 Years' War. After all, the Scandinavians are likely the ones actually competing over the Ohio Valley with England. While it could start between them and Scandinavia bribes France, that just doesn't feel right for these two. So I'm just going to say that it was something in India. Regardless, this time Scandinavia would almost certainly be on the back foot for a while. It's falling more and more behind Russia, and while it's keeping better pace with Austria and remains a powerful force in Germany and on the ocean, Russia's raw numbers are becoming harder to compete with. As a result, during this alternate 7 Years' War, most of Scandinavia's attention is on them, leaving France to deal with the rest of the continent. As a result, France loses the conflict, and with it, their colonial empire. However, Scandinavia, at least this one last time, is able to fend off Russia and preserve their place in Europe. I think I need to end the scenario here. With the conquest of the Baltic coast, Scandinavia has fought valiantly to contain Russia, but time has not been on their side, and the Tsardom is catching up one way or another. While Scandinavia is a much greater colonial power than they ever were in our timeline, their Baltic dominion is now far more uncertain. With their West African empire, their power in Indonesia, shared with the Dutch, and their blood money in the Caribbean, Scandinavia is certainly one of the wealthier societies in Europe, and that has translated to a greater and greater demand for political rights among the merchant class, which has recently pushed their demands against royal vanity projects in Germany. However, the question of whether or not they can retain this place in the sun is legitimate. Before we go, thank you to channel members Daikami, Nebula, Japdeep Gill, Nafumato, and Grimwalt, with an extra special thank you to Grimwalt for joining at the exclamation point level. Thank you for watching, and join me next time as we explore another alternate world.